Greetings, everyone, and welcome. It is I, Cantus Van Dracovin, your Lord and Emperor here at the Dracovin Empire. Alright, what do we have to talk about today? Well, we're diving back into the world of Pathfinder as we've been doing for a bit now. And this is going to be an interesting guide because certainly, if you've been here, you've seen that I've had guides for both Pathfinder 1st Edition and Pathfinder 2nd Edition on how to play many ancestries, or how they were called in 1st Edition, the races. But the idea of how to play them is one thing. What I want to talk about today is, because I've been talking about Golarion as a setting more, what it is to play an ancestry in that setting. Basic information that will be helpful to get an idea of the society and what it means to play. Because certainly, you can play whatever version of whatever you want, but the idealism, especially in our world, if you come from a certain place in the world, whether or not that's specifically a country or a region, there's cultural differences there. And that cultural difference, whether or not you've altered with your own evolving culture, has an effect on you. And that's an idea that we should discuss. So discussing the history and a little bit more of like how the culture and stuff works of the Dwarven people, in this case today, or any ancestry, is a good idea. So let's throw me over into the, of course, corner where I normally hang out with when we're talking about these things, especially with images like so. That should pop up there. There you go. Dwarves. So, dwarves. They're a humanoid race, of course. They're oftentimes make a lot of warriors, craftspeople. A lot of them have the ability to excel at jobs that many other ancestries on Golarion will find tedious. But they also do have a love of exploration and discovery. There are things like, there certainly are offensive terms that have been used against them because they are a shorter people. But certainly, many have kind of respect. So the dwarf, it's a stout humanoid, about a head shorter than most humans, and much broader. Very thick bones, tightly tacked muscles, and very good stability because of that. Because they are bulky, they weigh around the same as their human counterparts, even though they are shorter. They have coloration varying, like the Dwarves of Grund are more deeply tanned and weather-beaten, while the Dwarves of Vastia tend to be paler, especially that are in the far north of the lands of the Linnorm Kings, the Frosty Lands. So, similar to most other, honestly, ancestries, the region that you're from kind of determines your skin color. If you're from a hotter, more arid place, you tend to be more darker skin. You know, frozen areas can tend to be pale. They have a wide range of eye color, brown and gray being the most common, but some of them have very blue, almost shockingly blue irises. Hair is usually worn long, with Dwarven men spending a considerable amount of time growing, maintaining, and establishing long beards. Some popular beard decorations among more traditional dwarves include complex blades, small trophies from battle, and things associated with their lives. One of the worst offenses for a Dwarven man is to shave their beard. It's considered an insult to not only you as an individual, but to your ancestry and family. There is sexual dimorphism in the Dwarven physiology. Males tend to be a little bit more broader, though not really much taller. And they also have slab torsos, heavy eyebrows. The males also grow facial hair at an alarming rate to keep the beard, with an exception of one group, the Oast caste of Osirian, but we'll talk about them. Dwarven clothing, I'm certainly sure they are. So, the kind of things that the dwarves craft and their group crafts does tend to reflect the dress that they wear. Function tends to be what they go over style most of the time, but they also aren't plain clothed. Decorations are usually practical, with like special fasteners, reinforced seams, and other paddings or loops to hold weapons and tools. It doesn't mean that they can't be fancy, but those fancy decorations, these fancy like a loop for a tool, might be for a tool that I can like hook over here, like on my chest, like right here for easily grabbing or something, but it would be like a fancy loop or stuff like that. So it's like all the decorations you're going to have in a traditional dwarven outfit are practical. It's one of the important parts of them. All right, I'll move on. We'll switching images here. So, a big thing about a lot of dwarfs is they are not very forgiving, especially wrongdoings done to them or their families. It takes a lot to get over that sense of betrayal and insult of it. They can see through things like ancient prejudices, even ancient prejudices, or other hatreds, especially when someone earns that. A battle-tested friend will earn the respect of a dwarf no matter where they're from. Dwarves have prejudices because of some of their ancient battles, especially to certain other groups. Orcs, for one thing. But an orc and a dwarf fighting side by side can earn that respect. And true friendship from a dwarf is the most powerful thing they can give. They value true friends more than they do gold and gems, which, as a group that is specifically mines a lot and does have a love for these kind of things, especially, it can show that friendship is very important to dwarves. Now, for dwarven adventurers, treasure hunting and mercenary work are the two main things that dwarven adventurers often go into. Though a lot of times dwarven adventurers aren't there for just selfish profit. They do things like look for dwarven treasures that have been lost to history, recover land from enemies of dwarven kind, or just from wherever citadel they come from to kind of improve the fortune of it. As much as dwarves could look out for themselves to a degree, you still want a little bit of profit for yourself. You're always looking out for your family or the place you came from to a degree, or even having a goal by becoming an adventurer of doing something good for dwarven kind. It's kind of like this side thing of like, you want to be important to the history of your people because you are so connected to your people often. Martial roles are a very big favorite. Barbarians, fighters, monks, rangers tend to be the most, some of the core ones. Clerics and druids are very important. Not that any other class isn't available, but those tend to be the groups that a lot of dwarfs fall into, just because of the dwarven society. The martial role, of course, warriors and craftsmen, and the idea of higher calling when it comes to it are clerics and druids because of their connections with the mountains, of course for druids, and clerics because of their religion. Because Torag. Yes, we should talk about Torag for just a second, because Torag is a god known as the father of creation and the father of dwarven kind. There's Torag's holy symbol. So, yeah, a lawful good deity who opposes opposes destructive and aggressive deities, tends to be very good on protection and creation, has been an arch nemesis of Rovagug and its followers for the longest time. Other groups like the followers of Sarenrae, who also oppose Rovagug, they have trouble getting along with, but traditionally they do when they need to. And Torag is the head of the Dwarven Pantheon. So, I will dive more into Torag in a second, though, in a little bit here, but Torag's children, as they're known as, were underground. They lived and forged in the cities of Narvoth, fighting against orcs, and goblinoid races, and amongst themselves for eons. Narvoth is the uppermost region of the Darklands, basically the underground surface. About 2,000 feet down is where you get into that area that's Narvoth. The change that happened to this region where the dwarfs existed happened because of Earthfall. The massive earthquakes and destruction, collapses of a lot of caves, the orcs and dwarfs who had existed down here and basically been rivals since Immemorium, kind of were shoved to the surface. The dwarfs, of course, had their quest for the sky, led by Tarek. He was the one that oversaw... He was the first High King of the Dwarfs, also known as the King of the Sky. He led the quest for the sky, which I'll talk about, built a lot of the sky citadels, and founded Targadath. But the quest for the sky was the migration from the Darklands, from Narvoth, to the surface of Golarion. There was like a prophecy in Dwarven culture under Torag that when the ground shook, they must go to the surface, so the basically effects of the Earthfall, creating the tremors that shook the world when it was a catastrophic thing, caused them to go. It was nearly a 300-year trek, though. Very dangerous one, ascending from the Darklands. There was a lot of squabbling, setbacks, internal fighting, infighting. The dwarves fractured. They fought each other for nearly 2 decades. The orcs, of course, were taking advantage of this and fighting against them, their old enemies. And it was General Tarek, who became the High King, who used diplomacy, wisdom, and violence to group together everybody enough around negative 5,133 AR to push them forward. He got crowned king and had their go towards their goal. There were some that didn't leave the Darklands, of course, and stayed in Narvoth. They would become the Dwargar, who are kind of considered separately at this point in time. They evolved culturally, physically, differently over these thousands of years, separated from the Dwarven people here. So, the advance to the sky, the quest for the sky, the dwarfs had this idea that this would be the destruction of their ancient enemies, the orcs. The thing is, they were kind of mistaken. The orcs were already kind of leaving anyway, and their advance just forced them to go to the surface. So around 5102 AR negative, the Khelids were kind of displaced from a lot of their caves, and orcs poured out in the area of Nomeria, in around negative 5051. And then in negative 5088, they formed the Hold of Belkazin, the orc stronghold in that area, where they were attacked by various things. And there was a first battle. Anyway, the quest for the sky was technically completed in 4987 AR, where the first of the many big city fortresses known as the Sky Citadels were placed on the surface. So, yes. The Sky Citadels, as though they're called Sky, they are just dwarven fortresses found throughout Vasti and Grund. They were the ones that emerged into the Darklands to build them. There are a number of surviving Sky Citadels that still exist, but many of them have fallen. There are still a few, but there were 10 originally that were kind of built. Many are either in ruins or overrun now. And those that are inhabited by dwarfs, main connections to the Darkland realm of Narvoth, still patrolled. Because, again, these are where they emerged. So there is a way into the Darklands there, with many doors and traps and ways to detain anything else from following them up out of the Darklands. So, yeah. So that was the quest for the sky. Led by Tarek, who then became, of course, the first king, and kind of led the dwarfs into their version of modern-day dwarfism, in a way. Though it has been like 9,000 years since they've emerged on the surface. Certainly this was the start of Dwarven culture as it is known today from this one act, emerging from the Darklands and becoming surface dwellers. And of course the Targareth, the Dwarven kingdom that came about there, Dwarven Empire technically lasted for 6,500 years about. So it was a very powerful empire that was finally defeated by the Orc hordes, fell apart, and the heart of the empire became the Five Kings Mountains, which still exist today as their own kind of region. They don't have the same connection or unity as Targareth does, but again, it's the period of history of the dwarfs. Talking about ancient empires is not something I'm particularly getting into today, or, and there isn't a whole lot on Targareth, but, Let's, though, actually didn't do that. I wanted to be, there he goes. There's Targareth, the image of him. I forgot to switch to him. My bad. You can see the first High King of the Dwarfs of the Surface. There you go. Anyway, so, Dwarven society. Let's talk a little bit about that, because then we can hit up a little bit more about their religion. So society, they are very traditionalists. But their culture is also waning, and other nations of other races are arriving around the world. And so Dwarven society, as much as there is this heavier traditional sense to it, has been influenced in the modern version of Golarion by, of course, human, gnomish, and elven cultures. Older dwarfs tend to be, of course, nervous about these things. They ponder about, the end of Dwarven society as we know it, those kind of feels. But even with all the changes, dwarfs do what dwarfs do. Build fortifications, fight, craft, mine. Honestly, the things dwarfs love to do, they've done since the first dwarf. It doesn't matter the extra bits around the culture there. They still remain dwarfs. And craftsmen, they are skilled at. So, Dwarven society is divided traditionally into a number of clans. Each clan is associated with a particular gemstone cut in a certain shape. The stone is usually one common in the clan's lands, but rare enough to be valuable. The stones are often set in clan members' armors, on the hilt of weapons. Dwarves do keep extensive records. It's rare for any two clans to have the same stone and cut. That's an important part about it. Dwarves also forge special daggers in preparation for an infant's birth, which they usually use to cut the newborn's umbilical cord, then the dagger is given to the dwarf when they come of age. And they're charged with keeping it in good condition. When dwarfs marry, they create sheaths for their partner's daggers bearing their own clan gem. So, whether they're the same clan or different clans, that is a way of representing the differences between them. Dwarves speak Dwarvish. It's their main language. Though most dwarves are fluent in Taldane, the basic common, which shows up in great degree, of course, in both Grund and Avastia. Dwarves use a runic alphabet of Terran language, so their alphabet is the same as Terran. Dwarf names are full of harsh-sounding consonants, rarely include soft or sibilant sounds. Honorifics are common in given names, such as son, dam, hild. Son for son, dam for daughter, hild for wife. Family names sometimes contain words in common, such as gold and hammer. And Q and X does not appear in Dwarven. So there's a little bit of history of Dwarven language. Anyway, religion. Of course, I've mentioned Turag as the god of the forge, one of the main religions of the Dwarven people, though there is Caden Kalen, Gorum, and Abadar are given great respect within the Dwarven people. Torag's teachings tend to be the most cultural, insignificant, and thought. So there is a belief that, like, they should keep up with things like their duties, or Torag would abandon them. That's a mindset that still exists within Dwarven culture, even though these other deities have kind of slipped into Dwarven worship. There is, though, a small collection of specifically Dwarven worshipped gods that are generally considered to be related to Torag. So they're not really individually worshipped. They're kind of worshipped in relation to Torag. There's Angarad, Torag's younger brother, Fulgrit, his wife, Volkra, the daughter, Grunadar, their eldest son, Kolst, their middle son, Trun, their Grunhilda's youngest brother, Grunadar's youngest brother, the youngest child, Dranavit, I'm going to pronounce these so badly, Torag's half-sister, Magrim, his older brother, and there is only, and the only god in the Dwarven pantheon not related to Torag is the Dark Smith Droskar, the main deity of the Dwargar, but is technically in the pantheon. So, did I want to switch? Was I switching to this one? All right. So, there is a tradition amongst dwarfs which is very important to talk about, and that is, I'm going to mispronounce this one very badly, Gladdringgar. It's a runic inscription of the dwarf's name that is carved at the deepest point of their journey to an underground cavern. It's a traditional rite that many dwarfs do perform, but it's not really like something that even serious traditionalists... It's not limited to serious traditionalists, is what I mean. It's like a lot of dwarfs do this. It's kind of like the rite of toil, is what this tradition kind of translates as. Younger dwarfs have referred to it as Kangredin, or wall making. It's basically leaving a mark, being remembered. It's for those dwarfs that risk their lives delving into the ancestral homes of their people in the Darklands. This mark is a way for people to remember them, to see that these other ancestors and folks that pushed forward into that did this great service by exploring here or trying to discover stuff related to our ancient people. Again, it's that idea of Dwarven culture, our ancient people, that mindset that still exists within a lot of dwarves. I want to mute for blow my nose. Alright. So, there is a rite of passage to adulthood where younger dwarves can perform if they are male, a Gladdringgar Sun, if they're female, Gladdringgar Dam, where they basically inscribe their name next to a chosen family member as Gladdringgar. It represents this young dwarf's ambition to match their relatives' accomplishments, and an honor to be that the selective relative could enjoy. You know, it's sort of like, I'm going to match what you did or do better. So there's this idea of the exploration related to it. So the thing is, because dwarves are very hardworking, dedicated, they're tough, they do tend to look kind of down on other ancestries that don't have that kind of attitudes. Kind of see them as maybe frivolous, weak, degenerate. They really have elves are kind of that antithesis of a lot of what they do, so they're that kind of the ultimate expression of that kind of negative attitude towards others, that they, you know, the opposites of them, they don't see them. And they also see that because elves abandoned Golarion during Earthfall and then came back afterwards, that's one of those cultural things that certainly a dwarf can make a friend with an elf if they get to know them, but they're going to have that kind of preconceived of like, you guys left the planet and abandoned everybody and then came back. Still dislike orcs. Again, that ancient rivalry with them still exists because of the countless generations and in memoriam battling with orcs in the Darklands, and still even on the surface having battles with them. They do generally look at half-orcs in a more positive light. They don't look at them as negative. They give them the benefit of the doubt of more, maybe a little bit of suspicion, but certainly a full-blooded orc, Yeah, it's like that's even a much higher level to overcome for ancient enmities of, my people battled your people for tens of thousands of years. That's a little bit to overcome, It's not that it can't, but, ancient, super ancient enemies that you're still enemies with today, yeah. Kind of a hard one to overcome, unfortunately. But can be. So, culturally, the dwarfs are divided into 3 different groups. There's the Grondaksen, which are the dwarfs that still live underground, who have cities beneath the earth. The Holtaksen, the mountain dwarfs who live in cities high in the mountains. And the Ergaksen, or surface dwarfs, who are the ones that are scattered to the various lands. Of the Grondaksen cultural groups, they do include the Kolnet of Geb. This is a Kolnet dwarf here, being shown from Geb. The Grondaksen tend to be a little bit shorter. They have larger eyes than your average dwarf, and they have facial hair that is present even among women in this case. So when you're talking about female dwarfs with facial hair, usually Grondaksen, or a bit with very extensive facial hair. So they do believe that the quest for the sky was divinely ordered, but they believe that after they quested to the sky, they should have basically won for her into the caverns, and that staying under the sun was kind of a mistake. So that's why they live very much so underground in large caverns or extensive tunnels. They are very much more isolated than the wider world than your average groups of dwarfs, and use contact with the other dwarven groups and other dwarven societies as their way for news of the world. There are a lot of ancient agreements between these various underground dwarven cultures and those of the surface that they will visit the dwarven settlements for exchanging information and giving information on metalwork and stuff like that, and gaining stuff. So because they don't have day and night, they have a distinct daily clock divided into 12 hours of sleep and 20 hours of waking activity. It's a 32-hour cycle known as a forge day, and it dictates the cycle in which the forges are warmed and cooled. They traditionally dress very brown and gray, reinforced with metal to keep them safe during work. They are much more of a stability kind of group, and so very rarely they become adventurers, though some do. And those that do venture out are doing so because they have external threats, or they're dealing with internal ones that they wish to deal with, that they find a reason to leave. So yes. The second group, of course, and of course the Kolnet, which I mentioned, in Geb. They have a deep tawny skin, reddish-orange eyes, straight back hair. When traveling on above ground, they wear light armor and traveling clothes and goggles to shield their eyes from sand. They spread across Geb with underground tunnels and can navigate them without having to leave them their whole lives. No outsider ever returns from them, but there is supposedly, with the evidence that apparently they've got oasis cities protected by positive energies from the Gebite necromancy and corruption, where the Kolnet claim to basically live. And so they do oppose necromancy, Geb being a nation of necromancy and undead, but they do have relations with them out of necessary because they live in the mountains under Geb. Under the mountains in Geb, I should say. So that's the Kolnet, one of the groups of the Grondaksen. So, let's talk about the Holtaksen. I love these names. Dwarves have hell of a names. They really do. So these are mountain dwarves. It's one of the main subsets, of course. They live in fortresses among the mountain peaks. They're a few inches taller than most other dwarfs. Pupils are a little larger, and they have long hair that is often worn braided. They are they have this need to relive the days of the glory days of the quest for the sky. And out of all the dwarfs, the most militant ones are the Holtaksen and their cultures. They often go to war against the orcs and various giants, stockpiling great specials of treasure won in battle against them. They're not foolhardy, though, and make use of hit-and-run tactics in enemy territory and complex defenses of their campaigns. They do have a strong pull towards heroic quests, so it's rare to meet a mountain dwarf who's never been on an adventure at some point in their lives. Their clothing is muted and dark, though everyone wears a piece of clothing, usually a scarf and bandana, and bright colors matching their clan's traditional gemstone. It's called a glory ribbon. If a dwarf dies in battle, their companions tear up their ribbon and weave it into their own clothing. So that's a way to honor the dead that your companions honor the dead in that group there of the Holtaksen. And the last of the three main groups of dwarfs to talk about, of course, and that's the 5 Mountain King symbol that I put up on the board there, this is a Pahmet dwarf who's an Ergaksen. He's a surface dwarf, and one of the main subsets about it. And the things about the surface dwarfs, the Ergaksen, is the other 2 dwarven groups, because they are much more culturally unique, kind of lump all the Ergaksen together, and they consider the Ergaksen to be a single group, but they themselves don't. If they're dealing with their cavern or mountain-dwelling brethren, their cousins, they'll be fine with going by Ergaksen. But they're not really united culturally. Those that have spread along the surface and aren't in the mountains or the caverns have evolved their own cultures. The Pahmet of Osirian is just one of the many groups here. There's also the dragon worshipping Mekem and Torulu of the Mongi Expanse, the Montwick and Atheist of Vrard of the Eternal Oasis of Rahudum. There are plenty of dwarven cultures that have developed separately as this kind of subset of dwarfs. They've spread out and become separate. Of course, if we're going to talk about the Pahmet here, there's another Pahmet monk there. They're the Sand Dwarfs, native to Assyrian. They have dark bronze skin. Unique that they have the Dwarven pantheon that they worship, but they do focus on Megrim, Gundar, and Kolos. And they do also venerate Pharasma a lot because of their connections with sanctifying the dead and their tombs and cleansing of the undead interlopers. The thing is, there's legends that say they were the messengers of the gods. People that are more realistic believes that they were probably servants or slaves within Osirian early society during the ancient Osirian days. So, like a Pahmet guard of a royal tomb in the entire dynasty could have been a thing. Regardless, though, the ancient Osirians did sought advice from long-lived Pahmet, and so they have become this kind of important part of it. They've developed their own unique culture. Like, they live in the underground parts of the southwestern mountains, between Mount Oskski and the Carbono Pass. That's kind of their sovereign territory within Osirian. They are hostile towards disrespecting or threatening outsiders. Though, if you're reasonable, you could probably get passage into their areas. The hostile Brazen Frontier, which is rife with gnolls and slavers. The meet in battle, so they kind of keep those in that region at bay. They have the monastic city of Tar Kula, which is home to the Oat. There are sand dwarfs outside the Assyrian region. Kapash, Thuvia, Radum. Usually near like the lairs of sphinxes who they seek counsel to. And they like to share things like love of riddles, puzzles, and ciphers with Sphinx. So. There is also, in the western Okolos Mountains, a small clan of Pahmet dwell in the subterranean necropolis of Erkris. built to the side of a mountain as an acropolis for pharaohs, and they kind of guard over it. And Oetet is in the Brazen frontier of Osiren, is another group of trading. And currently, the Pahmet have not given any kind of support or not support to the current pharaoh of Osiren. They've kind of not indicated their connection with them at all at this point in time. So the Pahmet is a pretty unique and pretty large group of dwarfs. As you see, they're a unique culture and they're their own thing. But there are other groups. As I said, the Parine of Quaidrea. They're native to Pathinder, the capital of Quaidrin. They work with a lot of other communities in the city, but they kind of have their own culture. They're very few in number. They are a respected part of the Cathari society, and they traditionally live as business people and smiths, and worship Sarenrae in aspects tied to the Forge Fire. So, there's not a lot on this group, but they are a unique cultural group. Of course, from the Mwangi Expanse, we do have two groups too. One of which here is the Mebeke, who live in the Torawa uplands of the Mwangi Expanse. They're one of those two main groups. They have little contact with the other group, the Taralu Dwarfs of Eastern Jungles. They congregate in villages of several hundred individuals and live relatively traditional dwarven lifestyles. There is rumor that there is a sky citadel that's mostly intact within their territory, and that the Mekeb have close relations with a primal cloud dragon that live in the mountain ranges around the citadels. Of course, the Taralu that's also one of the Mwangi dwarven groups. Again, not having contact with the Mekebe. They don't practice dwarven traditions. Instead, they have an ancestor worship and totemism. They prefer dragons and wyverns as holy creatures. They are friendly towards other ancestries. And there are a number of Taralu living in Kuebe. And they've act as guides. There are 16 clans of the Taralu once lived in the Shattered Rains, as a traditional mountain dwarf culture. But the war between Geb and Nex kind of drove them to make a decision. They were kind of like in trouble. Magic ravaged them. A cloud raven named Tannen came to them to help desperate for help. So this cloud dragon came to them, magic ravaged during this battle. The dwarves were shaken and swore to honor her dying wish, to return her to the birthplace they might find some rest. They journeyed across the mountains into the Expanse and finally fulfilled the promise to Tannen. Tannen Shroud is the resting place and the psychic place of the Taralu to this day. So the Taralu dwarves changed from this experience by this like mighty dragon falling at them and begging for their help, and they had this massive societal crusade in order to save it. They are keenly aware of the horrors of war and magical misuse, and swore an oath to try to mediate the peace wherever they could. So they are very much more a peace-dwelling dwarven group, much more than other traditional dwarves that have a air of battle to them. Now, the other group that I did mention that we can take a look at here of the Ergaksen dwarven cultures is those native to the eternal oasis of Rahudum. They're monastic people that follow the nation's law of morality, and so are consequently atheists. They recognize the existence of the traditional dwarven pantheon, but do not believe the gods to be better than mortals. So there's a Vihard Varied dwarf, who is an atheist dwarf from Rahudum, the atheist nation. Anyway, so, if we're talking about dwarven culture as cultural heads, not just these individuals that represent a culture or the countries they live in, of course the Five King Mountains, which border on Druma, are one of the main places. The city of Heigelhelm in the Five King Mountains consider themselves to be the center of dwarven culture and life throughout the world. It is a metropolis of mostly dwarfs that kind of it's one of the ancient sky citadels, basically, and the center of not only the Five King Mountains, but I guess in a way you could consider it the center of Dwarven culture. Whether it really is or not is up to anybody to debate, but it's a major location. The Sky Citadel of Janderhof in Varisia is another major location for dwarfs. It's a very large city that is a particular Dwarven city. It's an old Sky Citadel in the Varisia Mindspin Mountains, north of Karoza, south of the Sinterlands. It's a big trade partner with Karoza. It's the main concentration of dwarfs in Varisia, and has a large population of the Shoutai outside the Sinterlands, and has some of the best smiths in the entire region. Of course, again, it's a Sky Citadel built during the Quest for the Sky, but it's existed since then and is one of the major Sky Citadels that still exist. Not that other Sky Citadels can't exist, that I talked about them, but they are in various levels of importance and repair and control, and both, of course, High Helm and Janderhof are two of the major ones. I mentioned when I was talking about the Dwarfs of Osirian, the Pahmet, the Oast, which are basically a caste of dwarven monks led by Menka Helg, who have a very different culture than your average dwarf. Certainly, they are culturally distinct even amongst the Pahmet. The Pahmet certainly, though they have some unique versions of their culture, are very dwarven still if you look at them for the joint dwarven culture. The Awat monks have taken a very different layer. They shave their heads, have a deeply tanned skin. Most of them are Pahmet dwarfs, but not all of them. They're contemplative, forego elaborate attire. They figure simple linen skirts and bare chests. And their existence has come about from around 1600 AR, so nearly 3,000 years they've existed. That Loigred, an ancient dwarven princess from Jorgamund, who fled an invasion in Garund and joined the Pahmet and Osirian, and then joined the monastery Oat in Tarkuta, where basically this monastery did exist there, but the origination of the monastic culture that exists now came about here when Loigred basically influenced them and caused this philosophical break from ancient dwarven traditions into mostly a inwardly self-perfection. So they are philosophers that worship a divine spark they believe to exist in each original creatures. Like followers of Roy or Nethys, they pursue perfection through self-improvement. They shun the dwarven pantheon and claim those deities are capable of leading individual dwarfs and their kind to a cosmic profession. There are scholars, martial artists at the monastery. Their combat techniques are an unarmed version of Pahmet's Spink-inspired mastery of hammers. Many Oat will serve Osirian mages as bodyguards. And they do live and congregate in Powerman Heights, so they do have connections with the rest of the Pahmet society, though, too. So that's another very interesting group there. And, of course, their other group that you can really talk about is Kalskagard, in the land of the Linorm Kings, far to the north, which is another major dwarven metropolis far to the north, in the Thanelands. So, it is a newer city, unlike some of the Sky cities, but certainly is a city that... it is particularly a human city, though, in the Thanelands, but there is a massive amount of dwarven population there. The Wild Warriors of the Kartskinland are a different group of dwarfs, too. Again, they're more influenced by the region they're in, the land of the Linorm King, a very dangerous area in the far north, and also the human cultures that they're connected with. Why did that disappear? Disappeared for a second. I don't know why. So, I talked about them, but there are some other equipment that dwarfs have. They're specifically dwarven. Of course, the clan dagger being the most important one. The one that I talked about being gifted them and being with them for their lives. And, of course, selling something like a clan dagger is a massive taboo amongst any dwarf. So that's a very important thing. Clan daggers are that big thing that you are gifted with kind of at your coming of age, and it was there from you since your birth. The maul axe, a weapon that features a sledgehammer on one head and a sharp blade. Various versions of their own war axes and spear-hafted Ergaksen. And stone plate, which is an alchemically strengthened piece of shale and basalt rock to create armor. So, there is your guide on dwarves. For some of these, I might do a couple of them if it doesn't look like I can have quite as deep a dive as I did here with the dwarfs. These are probably going to be a little shorter anyway, depending on the ancestry. Certainly, again, like when I talk about things like elves, they have a lot of distinct cultures. Gnomes, halflings have, unfortunately, kind of fall into the thing that they have some basic culture but adapted a lot to the human cultures that they've always lived along. And human have some basic cultural groups too, which I can also talk about. But that's also a harder one to dive deeper into, and might be one where I do multiple of. We'll always see. So this wasn't a particularly long episode today talking about dwarfs, but I think it was a very interesting one, diving so deep into them and looking at the dwarven culture as it exists on Golarion. There are distinctive cultural groups, and certainly in amongst the Ergaksen, there are unique members that have altered from this base idea of dwarfism that is what the Grondaksen and Holtaksen oftentimes still rely on, the old ideas of dwarfdom. When the dwarfs came to the surface and started to spread out, they began developing their own unique cultural ideas. A lot of them are based on these base ideas that are the dwarven traditionalism that still exists there, but they're evolving and changing, and especially, as we've said, influenced by the other cultures they're meeting around the world. Their time in amongst other cultures has begun to change them and make them culturally unique. And many interesting versions and groups of dwarfs exist out there, meaning that you, as your culturally distinct dwarf or your ancestor you're choosing, can have very interesting idea of where you come from and the kind of family you come from. Certainly looking at the dwarven ancestries, you can kind of take a look at the heritage. Things like ancient-blooded dwarfs would call for a Grondaksen. Anvil dwarfs, pretty much from anyway. Death Warden dwarfs, perhaps from a Pahmet, the Sand Dwarfs. Elemental Heart dwarfs. They mentioned the Mekebe and Taralu dwarfs in Long Expanse are oftentimes connected with those. Even the Death Warden could be from those of Geb, the Kulinet. So you can see that there are connections, and a lot of these ancestries do mention groups that they might come from, if not. And they could pretty much come from any of these cultural groups. There are some that are a little bit more connected to these things, but you can take a look at those ancestries and very easily see how they connect up with many of these groups. And I could become this version of this heritage in amongst them could be from anywhere. Plenty of heritages from plenty of places. But it also kind of gives you an idea of combining these two things, gives you an idea of where in the world do I come from as my dwarf? What kind of society do I come from? What kind of family did I grow up with? Asking these questions and getting answers that are beyond just you making something up. Because, again, we all can make up stuff for our backstories, for our characters. But when we are playing in a world that exists, having some information to allow us to understand that world is very important. And that's what I want to kind of show off with these series. And this first dive into it, I hope, has shown you that if you're playing a dwarf, there's some interesting ideas for playing one. And how to fit into Golarion. Golarion's a very interesting world with a lot of uniqueness to it. And, certainly, there are prejudices and hostilities within the dwarf people, some of which really aren't deserved, for something like the elves. Others with the orcs, are they really deserved? No, but you can understand it. The ancient animosity from them basically being eternal rivals for the longest time and battling against each other for tens of thousands of years. That'll make you not like someone. Does it mean that you're that kind of mindset instilled in your brain is good? No. But just like any people, dwarves can grow and understand, and there are plenty of dwarven adventurers out there. So if you want to play one, go ahead. I always recommend trying out everything and seeing everything, and there's some really cool ideas there too. Anyway, so I'm going to give it a drink here as we say goodbye, and we give ourselves a farewell. Remember, every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, tabletop up on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/the Dracovin Empire. Show up on the YouTube channel, usually a couple days, 1 to 2 couple days later. And that's about it. So I bid everyone out there a farewell.